Hi there, everybody. This is Queso You Didn't Know. Welcome to the Queso You Didn't Know podcast. I'm Queso. Joining me, as always, is the undeniable.
Roberto Simpson.
So, today, ladies and gentlemen, there is an image burned into the collective retina of the West. It's a silhouette, really. A woman. She's wrapped in layers of silk that cost more than a mid-sized house. Her face is a mask of terrifying perfection, stark ghost white. Her lips are tiny crimson crush painted to look like a flower bud. She moves with a silence that feels almost supernatural. We call her Geisha. And for about 150 years, the Western world has looked at this woman and asked one incredibly stupid, reductive question. So, how much for the night? We have obsessed over the idea that the geisha is just a fancy word for prostitute. We've projected our own Orientalist fantasies onto her. We've written books, made movies, told soldier stories that turn highly disciplined artists into nothing more than submissive dolls. But the reality is so much weirder, darker, and cooler than that. The word geisha literally translates to person of arts, not person of sex, person of arts. If you want a modern comparison, don't think escort, think method actor meets concert pianist meets negotiator. This is a profession where you have to master a dozen instruments, memorize thousands of poems, and navigate the ego of the most powerful politicians in the country, all while kneeling on a tatami mat for 6 hours without your legs falling asleep. But here is the twist that usually breaks people's brains. The geisha wasn't originally a woman. The original geisha were dudes. Today we are starting a three-part deep dive into the flower and willow world. We are going to look at the Saburuko, the desperate women of the 7th century. We are going to look at the Taikomochi, the male drum bearers who basically were medieval hype men. And we are going to look at the bloody, complex war between the geisha and the Oiran for the soul of the pleasure quarters. Welcome to the Geisha Chronicles.
Well, I guess we're here to uncover some more history, and why not be let this be the follow-up to things that shocked the hell out of you in history, the Asian Chronicles, so to speak. Uh, it's a nice profession, just to be an all-around eclectic enthusiast,
Oh, beyond
basically.
eclectic. You'll see as it goes on. Like I said, dozens of instruments, different languages sometimes, having to be able to sing poor T and know how to talk to men without stepping, quote unquote, to these guys, for sure. And I mean, how much did you know going into this? Did you have any idea? I didn't before I researched it that geisha used to be dudes.
Can't say I did. It's really, you just can't help but to be skeptical of everything, hearing stuff like this, kind of similar to what I said, but it just reigns true in this one still. Like, if the original geishas were dudes, what does that mean about lots of other things in history? Like, what does that say about just how we should perceive things?
That's fair. That's really fair. And I like to think we're doing a good job of helping people kind of rework their perceptions on things, and maybe they'll leave with a better, more open mind. And I think it really starts by looking at the history of certain things. Like to understand how we got to the tea houses of Kyoto, we have to look back, way back. We are looking at the 7th century in Japan. The political landscape is a mess. You've got the Taika reforms happening, clans are fighting, families are being displaced. It's a bad time to be poor, and it's an even worse, more terrible time to be a woman. Out of this chaos emerges a class of women called the Saburuko. Now, the Saburuko means those who serve, and this was a broad umbrella. It was a spectrum of survival. On one end of the spectrum, you had women who were essentially destitute, waiting tables, wandering streets, and yes, selling sexual favors just to eat. It was grim, it was survival work. But on the other end of the Sabruco spectrum, you had the elite. These were often the daughters of fallen families, educated women who had lost their status but kept their skills. They weren't selling their bodies, they were selling their presence. They were invited to elite social gatherings to dance, recite poetry, to elevate the general atmosphere. This is the first time we see this specific split in Japanese history, the separation between the body and the art. Fast forward a bit to the Heian period from 1794 to 1185. If you're a history nerd, you know this is the golden age of Japanese culture. This is the tale of the Genji era. It's also about aesthetics, poetry, and looking wistfully at the moon. In this environment, we get the shirabiyoshi, and these women were rock stars. The shirabiyoshi were female dancers. They had a gimmick, though. They dressed in male Shinto robes. They wore tall hats. They carried swords symbolically. They performed these solemn gender bending dances for the imperial court. They were highly educated. They could read and write, which wasn't a given, and they were treated with massive respect. Many of them became the secondary wives or partners of high ranking nobles and samurai. Why do we care about them? Because the shirabiyoshi laid the foundation. They proved that a woman could exist in the entertainment sphere and command respect through skill rather than just sexual availability. They were the spiritual grandmothers of the geisha. They set the standard. You aren't just a body to be looked at, you are a mind to be reckoned with.
All in all, what's really to be seen throughout ancient world history, because truth be told, there's a good amount of evidence that in North American and even ancient South American history, you know, different societies throughout Africa and European societies as well, that there's evidence to show that women lived decent lives to lives that were really better than our grandmothers and especially great grandmothers, you know. But in ancient Asian society, just truthfully speaking, women really had it the worst there, if we're just being blunt. So I think that this is really a good stepping stone as far as them weaving through the harshness of those societies.
I think you're dead accurate on that. And it shows that survivalism we saw in the ninjas existed in this culture in many ways and in different forms. That this is essentially the survival of women and trying to prosper and be more than a submissive woman. As you were saying, in Asian culture, these were the ladies realizing if we can play the game right, we can sit at the table without having to be sleeping with the people at the table.
And not only that, speaking of tables, you know, a lot of people, you could argue, especially during times like now, would kind of look down or look against wanting to do a job like waiting tables. But for women of those days, like that was really the peak of the mountain. Because if you weren't waiting tables, you were wandering the streets likely, selling sexual favors, you know? So like, which one would you rather do? You know, like if that's a hell of a thought to think that in those days for a woman, if you were waiting some tables, you were pretty damn all right. Especially imagine, I'm sure there were like a select few of women who were waiting tables and made a decent living, if not pretty decent living off of it.
And at least you knew you were like doing it yourself too. Like you are your own boss. As you
Yeah.
said, selling sexual favors, you're your own boss in a way, but you're like literally having to submit to someone else. Where waiting tables, it's like I'm making money on my own. I knew a lot of people growing up, I'm sure you did too, where their moms were waitresses and stuff and made enough to keep a house. So, I'm sure back then that would have been a very respected way to make a living.
hmm And not to make this too autobiographical, but we talked about how like throughout the town we grew up in, it's just so various. Like the different communities, it can showcase a various demographic of people. Like one house, it can be like you can tell based on the size of it, it's like probably a lawyer and somebody who's high up in a special company or something. And as far as the next house, it could be somebody like you work at Walmart and I, bartend and or wait tables, but we put our money together and still have everything that we need and enough to send our kids to school, in decent clothes and shit. So yeah, I get it. You can you can really fare off pretty decently if you're one of the lucky ones.
Exactly, exactly. And then the part that does kind of make me laugh, how do you feel about the we're gonna dress like men with swords? Like, I found that a little interesting too, that that was a selling point for them.
Right, right. um, I'm sure that would probably come across, the whole dressing like men, because I'm not gonna lie, what came across my mind when it came to this is I'm sure you're familiar with Coco Chanel
Hmm.
and just a certain androgyny of fashion and things like that. That's always the thing with women who I recognize who lived in harsh times for women, that they would practice in certain ways androgyny because it'd be looked at as a necessary avenue. And it shows like all throughout music, a lot of the early female rappers even started off dressing like dudes.
It stops people in a way from sexualizing you in that way. I have to reckon that it's like when you see a girl show up dressed like a man, you're not sitting here thinking, she looks good in them baggy ass fucking jeans. Instead, you're thinking, oh, it's one of the dudes or something, you know? And then she,
Yeah.
like you said, with rap especially, she starts rapping, and then you're thinking of it as matter of talent and skill, not matter of, oh, this a fine bitch. I don't even care if what she says is fire. I'm gonna tell her it is because she looks good. So I see what you're saying in the same sense almost. It's like both these cultures and a lot of the cultures in the past coming up to this point would do that, where it's like, well, I'm dressing this way, so you look at me as a man and judge me as like an equal instead of a object.
Yeah, I get it. And to be fair, like even artists who weren't rappers, because only two people out of TLC weren't rappers, and they dressed like men early on, like I said, but I don't know, they kind of flipped it by dressing like men, but talking sexually and stuff about what they want to do to a man. So they kind of made it work and cool, but did something else with it. But that's another story. But just overall. Yeah, culture of survival for sure is something ingrained in Asian society, you could say.
Especially when you start jumping forward, because when we get to the 13th century, you hit where the high-end aristocratic piece is gone. Now we are in the age of the samurai. It's blood, mud, and feudal war. The daimyo, the feudal lords, are stressed out. They are constantly worrying about being assassinated or losing their territory. They surround themselves with stoic, serious warriors all day. They need a break. They need someone to tell them a joke. They need a hype man. So they get the great, great, great ancestor of Flava Flav himself. No, they get the Taiko Mochi, which is, I guess, the same equivalent in the 1200s. Literally, the word means drum bearer. These were men. I'll repeat that again, men. They were the original geisha. In fact, for centuries, if you used the word geisha, everyone assumed you were talking about a man. These guys were a fascinating mix of court jester, military advisor, and tea master. Initially, they were actually advisors. They were planners who would sit down with the Lord, but over time, the job evolved. The lords didn't want advice, they wanted to be entertained. The Takamochi became professional storytellers. They would dance, they would crack jokes, they would curate the conversation to make sure the Lord felt like he was the smartest guy in the room. By the 1600s, the role had solidified. They were pure entertainers. They were called hokan or taikomochi, but they also started using the term geisha, artist. So picture this, it's 1700. You walk into a high-end party, you ask for a geisha, and out walks a guy named Kenji with a small hand drum who starts roasting the guests and doing a funny dance. That was the reality for hundreds of years. It wasn't until the mid 1700s that women started to encroach on this territory. The first recorded female geisha appeared in 1750 in Fukagawa district of Edo, Tokyo. Her name is Kikuye. She was a talented shamisen player, that little three-string banjo instrument. She called herself a female geisha, and frankly, the women were better at it. They were better conversationalists, they were better musicians, and they brought a grace that the men lacked. Within 50 years, by 1800, the women had completely hijacked the profession. The male geisha were pushed to the margins, becoming the takamochi or hokan we see today. And there are only a handful left in modern Japan. The women took the title, they took the prestige, and they locked the door behind them.
Pretty interesting. I don't know. Can you say that part of the reason that women were better overall at art, it would be because men would be relegated, especially like I said, in Asian society of those times. And really, this isn't so much ancient Asian society, even though it is older, because I don't know. As old as the 16 and 1700s is, it doesn't qualify as ancient technically in my view. Overall, I think men were relegated to mainly focusing on really more what they would consider, I think, right brain activity, more structural things in that type of society. And women were really left more to the daily events of life that would basically leave them, of course, a lot of time to think and a lot of time to come in contact with life and just emotions that would spark artistic thought and feeling. I think that's a part of it.
Well, and I'm sure they're kind of looking at life, like you said, in a different lens than a man is. That, like, they're going to be better conversationalists and shit, as you said, because they have more time to have conversation in the real world with each other. They're more in tune with their emotions. And they can look at the world, like you said, with that left brain and be able to come up there with questions like, have you ever thought about it this way or that way? And whoever they're serving will be sitting there going, oh my God, you know what? When Kenji used to come with his little drum, he would just always, agree with us because he's a dude. This gal's got a whole different view. I'ma listen to her. I don't know. Something like that.
Right, right, right. Just give me whatever thoughts you have on the obvious pattern for Western society to bastardize the view of something that comes from another culture, or at least completely. Could you say that they bastardized the view of the ninja?
I think they did, and I think they did here too, because think about, we said the ninja really weren't called ninja until the 1950s, and the one shared factor I see between all these things is you had a lot of American men get sent over to Japan during World War II and at the end of it. And that's where they come back with like if you see the American Akita dog, they basically just mixed bulldogs with Akitas because they wanted something that was big and badass to bring home. And they do the same thing with the other cultures. They see geisha and they think, damn, that girl's pretty. I'd like to have sex with her. I'm gonna go home to my family and tell her she was a whore because I don't bother to learn the culture. And I think even if it wasn't that character I just did doing it, I think that was a lot of what was happening. That there were a lot of servicemen that went over there, and even if they thought it was cool and weren't trying to be reductive like that, they see samurai, they think a certain thing. They see ninjas, they think a certain thing. They're not coming back with the full nuances of the culture the way we're learning about them now. They're coming back with the bits and pieces they could understand or retain. And then that's how we get what we think about these different types of jobs and classes and people of that society in America.
Yeah, I think I think it makes sense. And I want to say, what do you think would have took place for the geisha movement had men continued to just be the forefront of it? Do you overall, do you think that it would still be bastardized in the same way?
I don't think it is, and you'll see as we get to the third episode, it still exists in modern times, geishas do. but I think there's a lot more of an understanding of what a geisha actually is now because we're not the only ones doing this, in a way. We're learning about it to teach other people, but other people are learning too. That they did that movie Memoirs of a Geisha back in like 2005 or 2006 and they wrote a book and people then went to research because they're like, okay, this is cool. This thing was like gangbusters at the time, man, but then when you go digging, you realize, oh, this whole movie was fabricated from some white man's envision and romanticized Western version of what a geisha should be. So I think it's becoming more at the forefront, and I think you're starting to see the geisha that are still around realize that they're going to modernize their techniques, and a lot of them are TikTokers and stuff like that now. And so I think more so than ever, there's a certain generation that is learning, even though the geisha are like that big in number compared to what they were at their height, they exist as artists, not as beautiful looking call girls.
Right. But I know what you're talking about, and to be real with you, as soon as I found out we were doing a story on Geisha, that's what I first thought about at least. And I didn't know the movie of it, but if it was the whole they say that little line. They say that a geisha is to be so beautiful that a man is supposed to fall in love with her. I think she said with one glare, some shit like that. And yeah.
Yep, yep. See, I read the book back in the day, and it's an all right book, but then, like, even the guy that wrote it, it's not a great book because, as a writer, you're supposed to give your character agency. And the whole time he's writing this thing, this girl grows up to be a woman and is pretty much just a doll and a man's plaything. It's really kind of screwed up when you go back and look at it, and you're like, this woman had no agency in her life at all. She got sold to be a geisha, apparently, at like 5 and then was just a geisha until some rich man decided you could be my second wife. Like, at no point did she try running away. At no point did she decide she wanted to do something else. None of the decisions feel like hers. It's very much a white guy wrote a book about something he thought was pretty and wanted to make it his plaything in a weird way.
Hmm. And before we move on to the next passage, this is what's kind of related to that. Basically, that you have to give your in this in this particular moment that you have to give your character a redemption arc if it's necessary. Because I remember in this movie, you probably heard of it, at least Dead Presidents. And there's a guy, he ends up getting pistol whipped or hit with a gun and like having it shoved in his face and stuff. And like right outside of his home, basically. And he was basically talking a bunch of crap to him, and he didn't like the writer of that movie. He didn't like the fact that he didn't give that character a redemption arc. He didn't come back and whip his ass or something. He felt like it was necessary. So, as a writer yourself, I'm sure you could. Would you agree that something like that is necessary? Like that, if you have a guy like who takes a loss like that, you have to, give a redemption arc.
I think you do, and I think it could be compared to the Memoirs of a Geisha too, where like at some point, a redemption arc gives that character agency, and it's the same thing with this. Like, okay, you were sold to be a geisha, but then at some point you pulled Lucy Liu and Kill Bill, and you killed the motherfucker they were trying to pimp you out to and got away. I don't, yeah, yeah, it's almost the same thing where it's like you do need a redemption arc or a call to action in some way, or a character's just sitting there.
Yeah, it's like how I always talk about how the autobiography of Malcolm X would be dope as hell if it was fake, but the fact that it's real makes it even more dope. And the fact that he eventually broke from the Nation of Islam when he saw things weren't right, that makes it even more dope. So yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And you'll start to see what I mean when we come to these things we're talking about with like memoirs of a geisha and all that, because to get to the meat of the misunderstanding of what a geisha is, you need to understand the distinctions. In the Edo period, the Japanese government set up pleasure quarters, yukaku. These were walled districts. Think of them like Las Vegas, but with walls and guards. Inside these walls, anything went. You had entertainment, you had food, and you had sex. But the hierarchy inside these walls was rigid. At the very top of the food chain, you had the Oiran. The Oiran were the courtesans. They were the queens of the night. They were the sex workers, yes, But calling them Oiran, a prostitute, is like calling a Ferrari a car. It misses the point. They were celebrities, and they were high class. Visually, the Oiran were loud. They had massive bow-shaped wigs, loaded with 20 or 30 turquoise shell hairpins, kanzashi. It looked like a halo of expensive spikes. They wore towering black wooden clogs, komogita, 15 centimeters high. They walked with a specific figure-8 gait called hajimonji, and they wore no socks. The bare foot was considered erotic. They also wore explosive colors, gold embroidery, layers upon layers. And lastly, this is the key, the Oiran tied their obi in the front. Why? Because it's practical. It's easier to untie yourself if it's in the front. The Oiran were the main event, but they were also a lot. They were expensive. They were ceremonious. You couldn't hire an Oiran, you had to court her. You had to go through rituals. It was exhausting. Then you have the geisha rising up in the same districts. The geisha were the counterculture. If the Oiran was the high maintenance supermodel, the geisha was the much cooler, much more witty intellectual. They dressed much simpler in subdued colors. They tied their obi in the back, a complex knot that you cannot untie yourself. This was a visual signal saying, I am not available, I am sealed up. They also wore white tabi socks. Always. The government actually stepped in to regulate this. In 1779, they established a registry office, the Kinban. They laid down the law. Geisha were strictly forbidden from selling sexual services. Why? Not because of morality, because of union protection. The Oiran complained that the geisha were stealing their customers. The government wanted to protect the Oiran's business monopoly on sex. So they told the geisha, you can sing, you can dance, you can pour sake, but you cannot sleep with the clients. The regulation ironically saved the geisha. As the 19th century rolled on, the Oiran became seen as old-fashioned, stiff, and relics of the past. The geisha, because they focused on conversation, art, and adaptability, became the modern favorites. They were cheaper, though still expensive, they were more fun, and they didn't require 3 weeks of ritual just to have a drink with. By the mid 1800s, the Oiran were fading, and the geisha were the new icons of Japan.
Yeah, there's definitely a yin for every yang. Pun may be intended. Yeah, I can definitely say I'm glad history decided to go with the geishas and not the Oirons, just based on the way you describe them. I'll just put that out there.
One is a more fun version of the other, isn't it? I feel that. I feel that. Anything in particular that makes you feel like you're gladder that was the geisha, besides the terrible naming?
Yeah, I mean, what's more beneficial to society, to put it in the gist, the high maintenance supermodel or the cool, witty intellectual?
Fair enough. I knew the geisha were going to speak to you.
Yeah. So based on that alone, just thinking about certain people like not even not even a political activist or anything like that, people who put in that type of work. Like think about how somebody like Dave Chappelle, how much freer thinking and just more of an open mind a lots of people have when it comes to things, thanks to the comedies and workings of Dave Chappelle.
I definitely get that. That these guys were definitely offering more to culture than the Iran were.
Mhm. Overall. And ultimately, I'm sure that's why we eventually, I mean, of course, that's why we eventually got to Memoirs of a Geisha.
Exactly. And you really start seeing once they do the rollout, they hit this amazing period of just sustainability and adaptability and growth where they're not surviving, they're thriving. By the 1860s, the geisha enter their golden era. The shogunate falls, the Meiji Restoration begins, and Japan starts sprinting towards modernization. Samurai are cutting off their top knots and wearing Western suits. Buildings are turning into brick. But the geisha, they stood their ground. They became the curators of old Japan. If you were a politician or a rich merchant who wanted to feel like a traditional Japanese man of culture, you went to a geisha house. They were the fashion influencers. If a popular geisha in Tokyo started wearing a specific collar, every woman in the city was wearing it a week later. They were also powerful. By the 1920s, there were 80,000 geisha in Japan. 80,000! Today, there's maybe 1,000. So what killed the vibe? World War II. This is the darkest turn in the story. During the war, the geishas and their districts were shut down. The women were sent to work in factories. The flower and willow world went dark. Then came the occupation. 1945, Japan surrenders. American GIs flood the country. The country is starving and it is in ruins. You had thousands of women who were destitute. They needed to feed their families. So they put on kimonos, often cheap, brightly colored synthetic ones, painted their faces, and went to the areas where the American soldiers hung out. These women called themselves geisha girls. To an 18-year-old kid from Iowa stationed in Tokyo, he didn't know the difference. He didn't know about the 5 year apprenticeship. He didn't know about the shamisen playing and the training. He saw a woman in a kimono who said, I'm a geisha, and she was selling sex. These GIs went back to America and told stories. Oh, yeah, I had a geisha girlfriend. Geishas are great. They do whatever you want. They created the geisha girl stereotype that has plagued the profession for 80 years. The image of the geisha in the West became permanently fused with prostitution. Meanwhile, the real geisha, the women who had spent decades mastering their craft, were horrified. They came back to their districts to find their title had been stolen and dragged through the mud. An 1872 law hadn't helped either, ambiguously grouping prostitutes and geisha together in legal text. But the GIs solidified it. It is a branding nightmare that they are still trying to undo to this day.
All in all, what I see in this is lessons of learning what's black, white, and what has shades of gray. And I think this is a gray area. Truthfully, like, yeah, there's some context of geisha girl culture, even within areas that hasn't been trampled upon by certain stereotypes by outside forces. But at the end of the day, just within their culture as a whole, there's elements of prostitution. But again, like I said, as a whole, does that touch upon their whole culture? Are there many elements of their culture that go above and beyond that and have nothing to do with that simply? Or did can you argue that their culture didn't even originate from that? All of the above. And you see that happen. This is just one example of an event that happens often. You know, you have certain names that are certain cultures, you know, certain practices that are really drug throughout history, just drug reputation wise, and not really for a decent reason, you know.
I think you're dead on that. And I think that hopefully the next two episodes and this one will do a little bit to help clear up that name that, these guys are still trying to fix it. But hey, at least we're exposing that just because people try to link this to what this culture is doesn't mean that is what defines this culture.
Mhm. And it's nice that you also mentioned the element of them being the maintainers of old Japan. I think that you could argue every society needs that too. Speaking of yin and yang, like the future is supposed, of course, going to happen, and you need people to represent that. But I think you always need those old timers. It reminds you of the people in San Francisco who still dress like hippies and stuff.
I think that is a good comparison. Or like how they do Colonial Williamsburg on the East Coast and they all dress like they're from the Revolutionary era, and I think it is a good thing. Like you said, these girls are the ones that really added to the culture. They kept the culture alive. And I think that's why, even if they're down to 1,000 of them, you'll still see them well after our lifetime in Japan because they are keeping that. culture of Japan alive.
Hmm. For a fact, for a fact. And deep history overall. And between me and you, I think you put it out there kind of that the term geisha girl, of course geisha, but those group together, geisha girl, that wasn't even a term prior to the GIs, spreading those stories.
Not at all. That it was like I said, destitute women that were coming and claiming to be geisha girls instead of just geisha. Yep, they added that extra, I guess because girls makes them sound even like, oh, they're girls. They're just geisha girls. I don't know what a geisha is, but I know they're girls. So, yeah, no, it didn't exist, and it really ruined their name because, they were geisha, not geisha girls. And when they finally get home, they're like, oh, so these gals are going around being prostitutes wearing makeup and clothes like we kind of wear. And that's what people think of our culture now. And then they, like I said, spent 80 years trying to be like, no, we're not prostitutes. Sorry, Western world, that the first time you heard of us, you thought we were, but no, that's not us.
Yeah, well, who knows? Maybe if once we can make it past the copyright things, I think a good opening for this particular episode would be "Use a Hole" by Ludacris. No,
Oh,
just
yeah.
just kidding, just kidding.
No, no, but, and as you'll see, when we start really diving into the next two episodes. I mean, this is just the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg here. We established the history. Now we know they aren't prostitutes. We know they aren't the Oiron. We know they displaced the men. But that leaves the big question, how do you become one? If you think getting into Harvard or becoming a Navy SEAL is hard, wait until you hear about the Shikomi stage. In part two, we are going inside the Okaya, the geisha house. We are going to look at the training regimen that starts at 5 a.m. We're going to talk about the hairstyles that are so tight they induce baldness. We are going to talk about the Mizuyaji controversy, the selling of virginity, and separate Hollywood fiction from the dark historical reality. We are going to be entering the House of Pain and Perfection when you join us for part two of the Geisha Chronicles. This has been Queso You Didn't Know. As always, peace and love, everyone. See you next week as we continue. Mr. Talberto, any closing thoughts? Anything you'd like to plug? Anything at all you want to get out there in the ether, sir?
Well, it's funny how time flies when you're having fun. Overall, just want to say continue to, you know, support the guys. We're doing the Lord's work, as they say. Tolbert Simpson is the Instagram handle. Hit a guy up. I'm always here. Believe the Cheese, world's most dangerous podcast. And yeah, we'll see you later, people.
On Apple, on Spotify, on YouTube, and now Mr. Talberto is going to get that TikTok rolling one of these days. So see us there or be square. Have a good rest of your week, ladies and gentlemen.